Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you, Webster, for your leadership here in the Roanoke Valley and for your service to the business community of this region. Joyce, thank you so much for your leadership here and for hosting us, and to all the members of the board of the Chamber, thank you for serving the businesses. I have an opportunity to travel throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia, and I've been told that our relationship between the state chamber and the local chambers and regional chambers has never been better than it is today. And I value the role the local chambers play in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I also am so pleased to be joined here by Larry Dickinson of the branch group, who's on my board. Mark Lawrence is on my board, and Lee Wilhelm is on my board, and very grateful for their leadership, so be sure to thank them when you see them for their support. You know, Virginia has some headwinds. You don't have to go very far to recognize the challenges of the Virginia economy. We have been used in the Commonwealth of Virginia of being first in almost every way of measuring success. But in the last several years, with the downsizing of defense spending, and you'll hear today some of the statistics associated with this detail, we have seen those headwinds create challenges in the gross state product and regional state product, and we have seen some challenges and headwinds in the Commonwealth of Virginia. But I want you to know that I believe the fundamentals in the Commonwealth are in place for us to have a very prosperous future. Because what happens in Virginia is that we don't grow and prosper along political boundaries. We really grow and prosper along economic boundaries. And those of you who are here today represent the economic region of the Roanoke, greater Roanoke area. And this economic region has all the key components for success in the economy and for prosperity for your fellow citizens and for your businesses. You're really well connected to the outside world. We can always improve in that area with more daily flights to cities that help us compete. We always can improve with surface transportation investments, but we have the ability to move product and people from this region around the world. You have a great workforce, and the workforce here is second to none. You have the ability to produce products and deliver services that can compete with any region in the Commonwealth and any region in this country. And you have access to the intellectual capacity in a knowledge-based economy that truly will help you compete in the years ahead as it has in the years in the past. Your access to health care is first class, and the higher institutions of learning, from the community colleges to the university infrastructure, allows that intellectual capacity to succeed. There's no region in the country, none, growing and prospering without access to higher education and the intellectual capacity. So the last thing that really makes a region grow and prosper, in my view, is the leadership of the business community and the elected officials. Delegate Head and other members of the General Assembly who could not be here consistently receive the Virginia Free Enterprise Award from the State Chamber of Commerce. Some of you have asked me, what does the State Chamber of Commerce do? I know what the local chamber does. Well, we're really the voice of business to those in Richmond, and we're the voice of business to those in Washington. And I often am interacting with the governor's office and his staff and his secretaries about public policy considerations. My public policy team is also helping to interact with members of the General Assembly. I was asked, do you endorse candidates? We endorse ideas. We believe if we endorse the right ideas, the right public policy will become reality. That's why a few years ago we kicked off Blueprint Virginia, and you all were kind enough to host us here. We had over 7,000 participants, and we developed a blueprint for Virginia's future, and we gave it to members of the General Assembly, and we gave it to the governor-elect 2 weeks after he was elected. And we are advocating for pro-business initiatives within Blueprint Virginia. We also found it important to be able to measure our success, not just develop a plan, but measure our success and then report out how we're doing in the Commonwealth. And that's what leads us to where we are this morning. How are we doing? I used to have this pastor who said from time to time we needed to do a checkup from the neck up. And I always thought that that was important for us. And I think it's important for us as a Commonwealth to do a checkup from the neck up and just sort of determine how we are doing. And the best way to do that in business is what? Measure it. Create a financial statement. Look at our balance sheet and measure how we're doing, and then chart a course for the future. So how are we doing in the Commonwealth? Well, I'm pleased to present to everyone in this room today a copy of this book. It's on your table. We want you to take it with you. I think we may have a few extras, Mark, somewhere on the way out. They can pick them up at the table. We also have a one-page summary that Dr. Cook wrote in the Richmond Times as an op-ed piece. And the one-page summary does a really nice job, and we've reproduced that for them, Dr. Cook, and it'll be here for them on their way out as well. But we want you to have this today as an investor in your local chamber. And if you can only support one chamber, support this local chamber. If you'd like to support the state chamber, we're always welcome to have you as an investor as well. But take this with you as a gift from our chamber foundation. This chamber foundation invested in this report, and we want to thank those who also made it possible. Dr. Cook will show you their logos later, but Dominion Resources and Altria and Huntington Ingalls Industry, Smithfield Foods Foundation, U.S. Trust, First Piedmont, Dixon Hughes Goodman, and Union Bank. And I think Ed Lawhorn is here today, but Billy Beal from Richmond has been very supportive of this. They'll be recognized later, but they help make this possible. It's the private sector investment that makes this possible. And we're really pleased today that we have Dr. Cook and Dr. Fowler here. Maybe you don't know, and let me just more formally introduce them. I will just say this, Jim. I was told that we could speak as long as we wanted today, but they were all leaving at 9 o'clock. So I am well aware of the time, and I want to save most of the time that we have for these two distinguished gentlemen. Dr. Cook and Dr. Fowler work for the Center for Economic Analysis and Policy at the Strong College of Business at Old Dominion University for 15 years. And I'm very familiar with this. As mayor of Newport News, I attended every event. Dr. Cook and this Center for Business has produced a State of the Region report, which is highly followed by all businesses in the Hampton Roads area. And so it was his vision and my support and others that thought, why not do this for the Commonwealth? And so this is the first region we've appeared at where we're actually going around the state in the next 2 weeks, giving similar reports to business leaders and showing them how their region kind of fits into the Commonwealth and then how the Commonwealth fits into the country. But Dr. Cook is the leader of this effort. He is the former president of Old Dominion University. He is a Board of Visitors Professor Emeritus. Dr. Fowler is with him as an associate professor of economics at Old Dominion University, and they've done this in-depth, nonpartisan State of the Commonwealth Economic Report. I hope you find it thought-provoking, and I hope you find it of value, and thank you very much for being here this morning to hear that. Please welcome these two gentlemen to the program.
Thank you very much, and good morning. It's a delight to be here to talk about the state of the Commonwealth. This is my boiling gun. There are all kinds of people who you could blame for anything we say, but they are not responsible for our particular viewpoints, and this is really sort of an exercise in academic freedom. These are some of the private sector donors who made specific contributions. We've already talked about some very important companies who, in terms of our supporters, we wouldn't be here without them. So if you see any of them around, like, give them a pat on the back because they're very, very important to us. What we're going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about real incomes in Virginia, how we compare to other places in terms of the money we have actually available to spend. Chip Fowler is going to talk about the state, some national things, and some very low-known specific kinds of data. And I'm going to come back on and talk about some particular chapters in the report that deal with things like should we merge public services? Is there any evidence that that would pay off? Look at our airports and some things like that. So that's sort of the plan of attack this morning. This is a takeoff, of course, on the New York City thing. If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. What you're going to see is that New York City is not so hot when we compare it to Virginia. I'm going to show you some data, and unfortunately, Roanoke doesn't come out quite as well as we would like here, but the trends are good. But let's talk about real incomes. When you receive that check every month or that deposit deposit in your checking account, how much can you really buy with that? Once you take account of the cost of living, how much money can you really spend and what does it do for you? Well, the truth is that the median household in Virginia, this is the 50th percentile household, half bill, half a buck, has more real income than Manhattan, New York City. In fact, we have more spendable income in Virginia than Atlanta, Charlotte, you name the city up and down the East Coast. I want to show you some numbers here. This is Virginia. This is actual median household income. This is our cost of living, and that's our real spending income. This is the United States. Unfortunately, Roanoke's a bit further down, but if you see anybody from Philadelphia, you can go, nah, because you're well below Philadelphia in terms of the spendable income. In fact, if you look at Virginia in general, the amount of money that we actually have available to spend, what we can buy with that is much higher than the rest of the United States. And it isn't just Manhattan, it's any borough in New York City or mentioned. In fact, one of the reasons this is true is look at Brooklyn's cost of living, 188. No wonder they can't buy very much with the incomes they have there. So, all things considered, this is a pretty good time to be alive and well in the Commonwealth because incomes here go further than they do in many parts of the country. So, when you're talking about trying to attract firms to Rollout, to Virginia and the like, these are pretty good data to have available. Now, how equally is income distributed? Now, this is a graph that measures something called a Gini coefficient. Now, if everybody had the same income, the Gini coefficient would be 0. If only one person, Donald Trump, let's say, had all the income, nobody else had anything, then the Gini coefficient would be 1. So it varies between 0 and 1, and the higher the number, the less equal the income distribution. Well, you can see that New York City, Manhattan has the most unequal income distribution. Here's Virginia, and here's Roanoke, and so forth. So you can see that in general, incomes are more equally distributed in Virginia than they are in most of the rest of the nation. And that's something a lot of people think is fairly important in terms of equity considerations. I'm now going to turn to my colleague, Chip Fowler, who's going to talk about state and national trends.
Thank you, Jim. Good morning, everybody. Glad to be here. I thought I had a passport out here, but it turned out I could just come. It was great. We don't get out here very often, but we're really happy to be here. And I have a lot of data, a lot of information in the report. I just want to go briefly over a little bit of it, talk a little bit about the state, talk about some of the other metro areas, and then I also have some specific Roanoke information as well. Overall, Virginia economy has really struggled. 2013 and 2014 were very, very difficult in the state, quite challenging. The good news is all indications are pointing towards a much better 15 and a substantially better 16. So if we just take a look at the primary metric that we look at for economic growth, real GDP growth, you can see that Virginia for years and years had sort of this luxury of being about 0.5% to 1% higher than U.S. growth. That was kind of the standard. In fact, we have these sophisticated forecasting models we use, and I used to have a colleague that said, basically figure out what the U.S. GDP is going to be and add about 0.5% or 1% to it, and there you go. That's changed. In fact, if anything, we've sort of gone the other direction now. So last year in the state of Virginia, we came in at pretty flat. I mean, it's essentially 0. And there were only 2 states worse than this, Alaska and Mississippi, and they both contracted in 2014. So the impact of the slowdown in federal expenditures is very, very real. This is not something that we can just simply say, yeah, this may affect us, we're not sure. No, it's very real, and it is starting to bite. If you take a look at post-recession real GDP growth, so from the technical time the recession started to today, here are the metro areas in the state of Virginia. You can see there's really only 2 metro areas in the entire state that is outpacing the U.S. rate of growth, and that's Charlottesville and Blacksburg. And we have 2 metro areas in the state, Roanoke and Lynchburg, that have actually contracted over that same period. So this is definitely not great news, but relax. I mean, I'm a typical economist, we're going to whack you with all this right now, and there's some good news here at the end, so it's okay. If you take a look at some of the Roanoke specific data, as you guys know, I mean, you can probably feel this as well. The issue with Roanoke, though you have contracted even further since the technical end of the recession, all of that substantial contraction was at the front end. It really was a 2010, 2011, 2012 phenomenon. In fact, if you look at 13 and 14, Roanoke has started to grow. It started to grow at about a pace faster than the state average, about 1.3% in both periods. Terrific news. That's wonderful news. If you take a look at the state of Virginia overall and say, well, how do we compare against other states? Now, there's still some weakness, and that weakness shows up in this gap between the Virginia leading economic index line and these other states up here, Texas, North Carolina, and Florida. Why did I pick those states? Well, these are also pretty highly dependent DoD states. These represent number 2, number 4, and number 17 on the list of recipients for federal expenditures. So you can see, not only did the DoD impact influence Virginia, it influenced us even more so than some of these other states that are also highly dependent. So that's important information for us, because what that tells us is our economy is not only highly dependent on these federal expenditures, we're not very diversified away from them either. So even when you go to a private sector company, you say, okay, what's that company doing? A large amount of the revenue stream of that company is attached to government contracts. That's the piece that has really hit us that maybe didn't hit some of the other states quite so much. So how did we perform in terms of reestablishing employment relative to the recession? But we did about the same in the state as we did in the nation. It took us in Virginia about 79 months to reestablish employment levels that were consistent with pre-recession levels. That's a huge amount of time, by the way. That's about 3 times the typical amount it takes in normal recessions. So to call that what happened in 2008 the Great Recession is not an understatement. Absolutely, it was a great recession. The U.S. recovered in about 76 months, so we were about 3 months early. Where the picture changes dramatically is when we look at the metro areas. So this is the metro areas, and I left Northern Virginia off, not because I don't like them, but because it makes the picture a little bit ugly. There's too many lines going on. Northern Virginia recovered their jobs the fastest of any metro area in the state. They recovered in about 39 months. The rest of the metro areas, Richmond, and Richmond was about equal with Virginia. Blacksburg was about the same as Virginia. I can't put all the metro areas up there. But then you look at these 3, Roanoke, Hampton Roads, and Lynchburg. And all 3 metro areas have yet to recover all of the jobs lost. Now, level-wise, Hampton Roads is the largest. We're still about 18,000 jobs short in Hampton Roads. Here, not quite as much. The actual level amount is much, much smaller. Percentage amount is still pretty much the same as Hampton Roads. It's still about 3% below. The good news for everybody in this room is in 2015, you made tremendous strides into that. As you can see, Roanoke took a tremendous dip in the previous year, in 2014, and has since now started to bounce back some. And Hampton Roads also picked up some steam as well. So if we compare unemployment rates, that additional payroll growth that happened in the first part of 2015 in Roanoke has trimmed the unemployment rate down to about 4.3%. Now the issue with that is this number here. While 4.3%, I think we all would agree in this room, is better than the 7.9, which you had at the peak of the recession, 3.4 is the average unemployment rate that you all experienced from 2000 to 2007, which I think we all would agree was a very, very strong economic expansion. So we have a little ways to go in order to get to that number. But I will tell you this, most economists across the country believe that these numbers here are not going to be attainable going forward. There have been structural changes to the U.S. economy and to every state's economy that may make a number like 3.4 unattainable. So in reality, in terms of, let's say, a full unemployment rate for an area like Roanoke, we're getting it. I mean, we're pretty close. Let's take a look at some of the unemployment data specific to the region. This isn't a surprise here. These are just sort of the large employers for the Roanoke MSA. You can see a lot of names up there that probably look familiar. If you look at the employment growth in the industries to try and tease out which industries are growing, which industries are really getting hurt, the industries that are getting hurt are here in the red: retail, construction, local government jobs, and IT employment. The areas out here in blue are all the areas in which we've seen growth year over year. So this is October of this year through October last year. Education and health, state government, manufacturing, private sector. If you take a look at where those contribute in terms of the level of employment in those various industries, you can see that the healthcare and social assistance, this is sort of the education healthcare numbers, that's by far the largest sector of employment in the Roanoke MSA. And it's unsurprising. That's a very common theme in the western part of the state of Virginia. Education, healthcare, health assistance. And some of the other ones you can see in there as well. Construction, you can see, even with its declines, is still a very, very large employer. Now, the one area of concern that we do have is not just simply where the jobs, which sectors the jobs are growing, but what are the wages in those sectors? And the good news, I think, for Roanoke going forward is some of the areas in which we are having job growth, those are areas that have fairly good weekly average wages. So in some of the other areas of the state, we're seeing job growth, and we're seeing it sort of down here in areas that are very, very low wage jobs. So it's very good news for the Roanoke MSA. If you look at overall wage growth in the Roanoke MSA, it's 1.6%. It's sort of in line. Again, what's the silver lining? I'm trying to leave you guys with good feelings here. The silver lining is if you just take that data and look at the last 2 years of data in the Roanoke MSA, the Roanoke MSA has seen the largest wage growth of any metro area in the state for the last 2 years. So the whole period of the economic recovery, you're pretty much at the level of everybody else. The last 2 years, however, have been very strong with wage growth in the state. And that wage growth number, by the way, 3.5%, that is competitively strong with a number of MSAs across the nation. That's very strong wage growth. So some portions of the economy have, in fact, yet to recover. You do not have all of the jobs back that you lost during the recession. IT, government, construction, very, very hard hit. But that's very consistent across most of the metro areas in the state. The good news, however, is that you did have this very high wage growth the last 2 years. And one of the other pieces of information as of September, the data for October isn't out yet, but another piece of information that I think really bodes well is if you look at the Roanoke MSA, there are now 2 job openings active for every one unemployed individual. Now, I don't want to go too far with that because we have to worry about matches on skills and who are the unemployed versus what are the jobs and so on. And that data does exist. I just didn't drill down that deep yet on it. But this is still pretty good news. I mean, we basically have 2 jobs floating around out there for every one individual. So let's take a look at DOD overall in Virginia, because I think everybody would agree that the defense spending has hit every metro area. And it's kind of surprising. I think that's something I wasn't prepared to see, was actually how much. I thought this was very much a Northern Virginia, Hampton Roads, Richmond issue. It's not. I mean, it's very widespread throughout the state. So DOD spending influences regions in 2 ways. You have compensation, direct compensation for military and civilian workers, and then you have these government contracts. Both of these measures are bad for the state. So if you look at direct compensation, military active duty compensation on average has fallen about 3%, and federal government civilian employee wages have fallen that are essentially flat. 0.3% is essentially flat. If you look at the DoD awards to firms and businesses in the state of Virginia, they've dropped by about $10 million. So that's also additional, that's an additional piece of drag on the economy. And that's through August. So where is this coming from? Well, some of you are familiar with seeing this picture probably. This is the new sort of sequestration, the world of sequestration that we get to deal with from now on. So the gap between the blue line and the red line is effectively the difference between the Budget Control Act of 2011 and sequestration. What you're seeing here with these fill-ins are the bipartisan budget agreements that are trying to soften the sequestration, so adding a little bit of money back. And that's where we've seen some benefits to all of the metro areas in that the cuts haven't been even more severe. One of the sectors in the state of Virginia that is performing very well is the port. So port operating incomes have actually risen substantially. In fact, they've gone from negative to substantially positive. And the majority of that comes from this growth in the handling of containers. Now, you may say, well, that's out in Hampton Roads. What's that have to do with Roanoke? Well, here's the map of the firms in the state of Virginia that rely either on the importation through the port or exports from the port. So this is absolutely a statewide issue. And the Port of Virginia is doing extremely well in 2015, and that's good news. Roanoke, I think, is pretty, tourism is pretty important out in this part of the area. In Virginia, we have some good news. Hotel revenues are up, they're up dramatically. These numbers will tail off slightly as we add in the data from November and December, which tends to be a little bit weaker. But regardless, we're going to get a number in 2015 that's well in excess of the $59 that we saw per room in 2014. What about the overall growth? Well, Roanoke is a little interesting. Sort of the MSA is kind of split. If you look at how we define the tourism regions, you've got a little bit over here in what we call the Virginia Mountains region, and then we have some of the MSA counties that are in the Blue Ridge Highlands region. Either way, regardless of how you stack it, 2014 was better than 13. The data for 15 will be in sort of, I think they come in somewhere around May of next year. Up 4% and up 2.9%. So overall, the tourism industry and hotel industry is looking pretty solid in 2015. One of the big areas for most metro areas, particularly an area like Roanoke, is what happens with construction and residential housing. That's a big component of the area. So the housing price growth overall in Virginia, you can see we are a little bit higher than the U.S. pre-recession, fell a little bit harder during the recession, and have bounced back a little bit less post-recession. Total sales in Roanoke, look, I can show this picture for pretty much every metro area in the United States of America. They peaked in right before the contraction in 2007 at 9,000, and we're about a third of that now each year. The good news, however, I think out here is we've seen a marked reduction over time of the number of existing home sales that are already over short sales. And that's important because as those clear out of the market, they tend to have very depressed prices. And as those clear out of the market, we anticipate prices would improve. So if you look at recent home price growth, here is your 2000 to 2008 home price growth on average. So you've averaged each year about a 55% growth in home prices. During the contraction, it grew at about 10.9 overall. The early part of the recovery was pretty flat, and now you can see we're starting to see some fairly good home price growth at about 8%. Okay, so overall, what are we anticipating for the U.S. and Virginia and Roanoke? So we do three models at the center. We forecast national GDP, we forecast state GDP, and we forecast Hampton Roads GDP, just because that's where we are. But we also keep track on all the other MSAs as well, so we have some ideas for Roanoke. So here are our forecasts out here at the end. This is where we ended in 2014. So we're expecting the United States to finish 2015 at about 2.4% GDP growth. And then we're expecting a pretty strong 2016. As of now, it's 2.98. One caveat to that is this model, because we don't have Fed movement yet, this model is taking this current state of nature as the state of nature. So once the Fed makes a decision, which they perhaps might make next week, we will then be able to augment this and think about how that might play into economic growth. For Virginia, I think we're going to be stuck in this sort of status quo-ish idea for another few years. We're going to be about 1% below the U.S. So we're expecting us to grow at about 1.33 this year. I mean, it was 0.02 last year, so I think we all will take 1.33. Remember, Roanoke is right in line with that number, about 1.3, 1.4. And then we are expecting a pickup in 2016 of 1.98. So this is going to be a struggle moving forward. I do think that the state and most of the metro areas are going to have to learn to be comfortable with GDP growth rates around 2%. That might be a reality for a period of time. But I can tell you this, I think the state is very well positioned, as Barry put it, to move forward after we sort of digest and make some decisions regarding the new reality of federal expenditures. It's time for us to diversify our economy a little bit. And one of the things that, if I can leave you with this last thought, I get a lot of people saying, well, we've seen this story before. This is Detroit. This is Pittsburgh. This is Buffalo. It is not. It is absolutely not. What gets produced in Virginia, the goods and services produced by our private companies, are eminently consumable by the private sector. For various business reasons, those firms have chosen to sell large contracts to the government over the years. But we have an advantage those other areas didn't, and that is people still want to buy our goods and services. Whether the government buys them or the private sector buys them, that's a business decision. And I think what we're learning is that some of the firms are going to have to learn to diversify their revenue stream a bit, away from just pure government contracts and towards some private sector activity. So with that, I'll turn it back over to my colleague.
Thanks, Joe. Let's sort of shift gears now and talk about a couple of specific issues and problems. And let's start with airports. Picture in Virginia in terms of airport patrons and the number of flights and so forth is not such a good one. And you can see Roanoke here is about right in the middle, but doing much better than Dulles and Newport News Williamsburg. Newport News Williamsburg lost a major carrier, and that's the primary reason their numbers are so far down. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Dulles, because that is a major international gateway for us in Virginia. But you can see that, except for Reagan, I'll talk about it a little bit more, all the rest of the airports in the Commonwealth have really been suffering. Now, the Great Recession has a good deal to do with that, but it's not all due to that, as you can see. But if you look at Dulles and Reagan, Reagan's been catching up to Dulles, and the primary reason is simply the Congress. Congressmen like to get out of the Congress and take a short cab ride to Reagan and then go wherever they want to go. It used to be the case that Reagan was not allowed to take flights or have flights that would go beyond roughly about 500 miles and no international flights as well. Well, the Congress has changed that, so Reagan now is actively competing with Dulles on longer flights. So what used to be called the perimeter rule, which limited how far Reagan flights could go out, that's really been dissipated quite a bit, and so Reagan now has flights going to Los Angeles and Seattle and places like that. So that's been very good for Reagan, but not so good for Dulles. Now, at the same time, we've seen consolidation in the airline industry. They're putting fewer seats out, their load factors are going up, and of course their profitability is going up as a consequence. That's good for them, but it's not so good, let's say, for Roanoke, because you don't have as many seats going in and out. And that, of course, is something that's, I think, significantly related to economic growth. It's tough to tell a firm that you want them to locate here or to expand if they can't get in and out with air service. Let's again shift gears and talk about the possibility of merging public services. We have lots of governmental units in the Commonwealth, 95 counties, 39 independent cities, and 95 towns. Okay? So there are 200 plus governmental units out there, plus lots of others, school districts and sanitation districts and so forth. And so we have lots of governmental units, and it's natural to ask, well, what would happen if they began to supply some of these services together? If we merged them, could we save money? Are there economies of scale? And so that's really the question that we address in this chapter is, what does the evidence look like? Fortunately, the Auditor of Public Accounts publishes really detailed numbers on who's spending how much for more than 24 public services. So we can do some analysis there that's actually pretty interesting. And there are lots of examples of merged services throughout the Commonwealth, and really the question then is, should we do more of that? We control for lots of different factors. The major factor we control for right at the beginning, though, is the cost of living. The cost of living in Alexandria is about 40% higher than it is, let's say, in Lynchburg. I pick out Lynchburg because its cost of living is exactly 100. If we observe then higher costs of supplying a service in Alexandria, it doesn't necessarily mean they're less efficient. It just means it's more expensive. So one of the things we had to do is sort of control for that. And then we control for a lot of other factors that might plausibly influence how much of a service is being supplied, but doesn't necessarily mean you're efficient or inefficient. Let's look at general financial and administrative services. Everybody's got to do those. Galax, population 7,000, that's their per capita cost of supplying general financial and administrative services. This is the median-sized governmental unit in Virginia, median again being the 50th percentile unit. So that means that half of the governmental units in Virginia are smaller than this. Okay? Pretty expensive supply. You can see Danville, Richmond, Virginia Beach, and Fairfax County. And you put these dots together, and this is what it looks like. That naturally leads to the supposition that apparently there are economies of scale in doing and supplying this particular service until you get to about 640,000 people. And that naturally then leads to sort of the supposition that maybe this is kind of service that we could merge together and supply together and end up being better off. Let's go to a completely different kind of service. Let's talk about the maintenance of roads, bridges, and highways. And here you'll see that the dots look rather different. Here's Augusta County, here's Arlington County, Virginia Beach, Fairfax County. Again, you look at these dots, and what you see is that it's pretty flat here. It's flat till well above 400,000, meaning there are not economies of scale, pretty constant cost till you get pretty big, and then there are some economies of scale. So you connect those dots together, and the conclusion here is that until you get to roughly 240,000, there aren't really major economies of scale to be realized. You don't realize then significant cost economies. Well, we looked at more than 24 services. These are the ones where it appears as if, when you plot the dots, this is where we ought to be talking about combining the supply and provision of these particular public services. Not all of them are on the list here, but many are. Now, there are political problems obviously attached with all of this, and it clearly doesn't mean that because you have, let's say, one service being supplied, let's say, Virginia's Eastern Shore and another in the Roanoke area, you can somehow combine those magically across all that space. So there are lots of difficulties here, but these are the services where we ought to be having conversations. Now, can we look at the data that I just showed you, data like that, and infer anything about efficiency of operation? Well, maybe, and let me show you how we might do that. let's look at what cities and counties are actually spending for all of these services combined relative to what the model says we would predict they would be spending. Based upon their characteristics at 11 or 12 factories, how much would we predict they would be spending per unit? Let's compare that to what they're actually spending. Well, here's the overall average, the county average. You can see the cities are spending more, okay? Let's look at Lynchburg. This is what Lynchburg is spending, an index of 103, okay? And our predicted index is 111. That suggests that Lynchburg is efficient. Or, another explanation, an alternative would be they're not supplying as much of it or as well. They're not doing things that are, let's say, the similar level of quality. Let's look at Northampton County. You can see Northampton County is spending more than we would predict. Winchester is spending less. We could go down every city, including Roanoke, and look at specific services and the like and get some notion about how efficient currently the city or county is. So this particular data set is pretty rich in terms of what one can infer from it. Incidentally, Rollout turns out pretty good on this particular analysis. It's a good segue. Let's talk now about people moving in and out of metropolitan areas. If we look at moving, there's lots more of that happening in Virginia. I found these they're very interesting. About 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, 92% of all the people who were living in Virginia were born there. Now it's only 49%. So roughly half of us in this room were born in Virginia. It used to be more than 90%. So we've become a much more mobile population. So why do people move? Well, if we look at the numbers here, we had in 2012, 312,000 people who moved in, okay? 250,000 of these people weren't moving inside Virginia, they were coming from outside of Virginia. But if you go further down here, what I really find interesting is the educational level. Almost 75% of the people who were moving in and out of Virginia metropolitan areas had a bachelor's degree or more. So it tends to be a highly educated group of people who are doing most of the moves. And you look at where they're coming from and where they're going to. They're coming from, if you look at California and New York, they are two of the states nationally that have the largest out-migration. California and New York are really losing lots of people in net terms. They're gaining immigrants and so forth, but if you look at the people who are already there are lots of people moving out. And if you look at which areas have been gaining and losing the most, if you look at Roanoke, gained 745, and lost a net of 314 in terms of net migration. That means that when you sort of put it all together, Roanoke actually had out-migration over this time period. Not a tremendously large out-migration, but that part predominantly reflects job availability. So that's really the question we address. Why is this occurring? And an economist who's now dead, Charlie Tebow, and he said something that I guess is blindingly obvious, and that is people vote with their feet. They move from one area to another because of jobs, but also because of amenities and other kinds of things. Well, our analysis indicates, with this large sample of 358 metropolitan areas nationally, that job availability is the primary thing. But so also is economic freedom. What do I mean by this? Well, there's some economists that try to measure how easily one can open up a new business. What are the licensure requirements to get into a trade? How much you have to do to start doing something like that. And they've put all this together, and I want to show you an index. I'll come back to the other stuff in a moment. These are economic freedom indices for Virginia communities. Roanoke looks pretty good here, because the national average is 6.54, Roanoke is a higher number, so there is relatively more, according to these economists, economic freedom in Roanoke than much of other places. That's a good thing, because it turns out that one's ability to sort of come in on an area and create a new business and do what you want and the like is pretty important in terms of attracting business. Now, these things turned out to be not quite so important in terms of our analysis. Metropolitan area size, not so important. You can be New York City as compared to Roanoke, and that's not a real advantage. Climate and taxation levels and so forth didn't turn out to be terribly crucial. We now talk just a little bit about Richard Flores. I don't know if you ever had him come to speak here, but he sold lots of books. In fact, I always point out that he sold more books than I have. Oh, I made the New York Times top 10. He's made the New York Times top 10. He's been #1, and he's done very well. Well, he has a sort of theory about the creative classes and sort of camping, sort of hip people, and that's what causes people, causes economic growth. Well, long story short, his variable don't explain hardly any of the variability of people moving from one area to another. His particular model doesn't do very well in this regard. Now, I was talking about taxation levels. Our analysis suggests that people don't look much at taxation levels when they're moving from one area to another. If you don't have a job, you're not so concerned about what the marginal tax rate is. That's very different, though, than tax policy over, let's say, a decade. Persistently high tax rates are pretty deadly, we find in our analysis in terms of deterring people from moving over a long period of time. If you look at New York, the state of New York, they can have all the ads they want on TV about how easy it is to be there and so forth. You maybe have seen some of these, but 153,000 people net out migration in 2014. California is the same thing. They're really suffering in this regard. The tax policy that over a long period of time makes a difference. Let me finish up with talking about small business. Here I'm talking about really small ones, maybe up to, let's say, 10 employees. This particular graph shows the percentage of all businesses in Virginia that are small. And we're starting in 1988 here. You can see that 0 to 4 employees, this percentage actually went up and has been holding kind of constant. If you look at 5 to 9 employees, it's gone down slightly. But basically the story here is we have just about as many small businesses now in Virginia as we had 25 years ago. However, if you look at this particular graph, it's looking at the percentage of employment that is accounted for by small firms. And there you can see that these percentages for 0 to 4 employees have gone down, for 5 to 9 employees have gone down. But if you're talking about 500 or more employees, that percentage has gone up. So even though there are just as many small businesses, they're not accounting for as much for employment and so forth. And that's not necessarily a great development, but it's reflective of this particular phenomenon. It is that small business formation, in fact, business formation in general, has sort of tapered off in the United States. We don't have as many startup new businesses now nationally as we used to. That particular rate has gone down, and that's an object of concern because it really directly relates to productivity. Let's stop there, and if we have 7 minutes for questions.
Yeah, okay. Let's see if we have great job on time. Just a couple minutes for questions. Anybody have any comments or questions about Dr. Fowler or Dr. Cook's presentations? They'll be standing around here afterwards, and you can come up and ask them individually. But if you want to ask one in front of everybody else, now will be the time. It's like you did a great job, professors.
My students would not be this kind. We'll be here afterwards, so come up and grab our.
Thank you very much, Lana.